friends. We are a small number. We were supposed to be a bigger number because I have around 50 people registered for tonight, but I think the togetherness of virus, cold and rain is not a very good promising thing to bring people out of their houses. In any case, I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity of discussing this topic on Palestinian refugees tonight. We are all witnessing in these days a big number of refugees coming from Ukraine, and we are positively surprised by the support and by the help that the population is giving to this to these refugees, and we are also kind of surprised how other refugees are not concluded into this kind of generosity. I think this will be one of the topics that we will also discuss, since we are talking about a huge refugee community, probably the oldest one in the world, which is still in camps. I'm very grateful to Lex Takkenberg, who published this important, very, very thick book on the refugee issue, the quest for solutions, together with Albanese. And some of you know Lex is a senior advisor on the question of Palestine at the civil society organization Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, which is based in Amman, if I'm correct. And he's a non-resident professor of humanitarian affairs at Fordham University. He held prior to these positions important positions in UNRWA, including in Gaza, Syria, and in the headquarters. And I think this experience of his many years engagement in UNRWA was the source and the richness of the volume that he was writing. I'm very happy that Bashir is back in the Crises Forum. Many of you know him. He is a senior fellow and curator of the program with Journalism and Borders, Arab-Jewish engagements in the Crises Forum in the last 10 years, with an important publication that was that came out 2 years ago at Columbia University Press, the Arab and Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagements. Bashir is Associate Professor at Open University of Israel and a Research Fellow at Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Without further stealing time to both of you, I am very thankful to you for having you, and wish us all a very interesting evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gertrude. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great honor always to be back at the Crises Forum, and it's a second home for me, so it feels lovely to be here always. What we're going to do, I'm going to ask Lex to make introductory remarks, maybe for 10 minutes. Then I will be posing or coming with some reflections on what he is going to say, and then we will make a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then we will open it for questions with the crowd. Okay, so please, Lex, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bashir. Thank you, Gertrude, for the invitation, and to the Crises Forum for organizing the event. I'm also very excited to be here and also to meet you for the first time in person, Bashir. I've followed and admired your work for years, and I consider you one of the most inspiring Palestinian thinkers of the current era, so I'm quite honored to have the floor with you today. Yeah, for this sort of first introduction, I thought it would be good. Gertrude was already saying, you know, we're witnessing and experiencing so many new refugee situations now. The enormous refugee influx from Ukraine. I think it's therefore important to briefly sort of recall what is this Palestinian refugee issue about and why more than 7 decades after its inception it still matters and is still an issue of concern. So who are the Palestinian refugees? In general terms, they are the Palestinian Arabs, the Arab population of Mandate Palestine, going back to the days of the British Mandate over Palestine, who have been displaced, not just of war, but rather as a result of Zionist settlement in Palestine, which has had as its ambition to gain as much territory as possible for exclusive Jewish benefit. And even if not all Zionist thinkers and decision makers agreed with that interpretation of Zionism, this was the ideology that was effectively being implemented. And the depopulation of Palestinian communities in Palestine started well before 1948, with evidence indicating that more than 50 Palestinian villages were uprooted and erased before Israel's establishment. And accordingly, the 1948 war was not the starting point of Palestinian displacement, but rather the zenith in a process of systematic depopulation, referred to in more recent parlance as ethnic cleansing. Not a precise legal term, but something that we have got used to since the situation in former Yugoslavia, and a term that Ilan Pape has applied also to the origins of the Palestinian displacement in his book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Not only were 750,000 Palestinians forcibly displaced between 47 and 49, they were subsequently denied return, dispossessed and denationalized en masse in flagrant violation of international law. The same applied to the 350,000 Palestinians that were uprooted in the course of the 1967 war. Half of them already refugees from the 48 war. This policy of depopulation and denial of return has continued until today, with the threatened expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, and drew a lot of attention last year and were instrumental in the outbreak of violence in April-May of last year, as well as threatened expulsions in the Nakba, in the south of Israel, which is the latest example of the ongoing Nakba, the term used by Palestinians to refer to the catastrophe of their displacement, an ongoing displacement. During the past 7 decades, the Palestinian refugees have been dispersed over all 4 corners of the globe. And when we were researching the book, we counted and collected information about Palestinians in more than 50 countries around the world. We described the situation they find themselves in two chapters in the middle part of the book. One on Palestinians in the MENA region, and one on Palestinians in the rest of the world. The majority of the Palestinian refugees continue to reside in the countries and territories where UNRWA, the UN agency created to provide the refugees with assistance and protection, operates: the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. They are status and practical treatment has been fluctuating between countries as well as over time, depending on the applicable legal regime adopted in those countries and political considerations. And it has quite dramatically fluctuated over time. In Egypt, for example, where Palestinians during the Nasser era were enjoying a very good treatment, a very strong status, which dramatically deteriorated following Nasser's death. And the same applies to other parts of the Middle East. And dramatic differences, as we know, Palestinian refugees in Jordan have been granted citizenship and therefore enjoy the same rights as sort of Jordanians. In Syria, Palestinian refugees also by law enjoy status on very similar par with Syrian nationals. But by Lebanon, by contrast, refugees are barely tolerated, being seen as a perceived and actual threat to the stability of the country. So very great differences in the status of Palestinian refugees depending on the countries they find themselves in, as well as changes over time. Now, according to the applicable norms of international law in force in 1948, including legal principles which had just been reaffirmed, not many people are aware of it, but principles that had just been reaffirmed by the Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes tribunals just a few years before the Nakba, the execution of Israel's policy of depopulation and ethnic cleansing amounted to crimes against humanity and war crimes, not only triggering individual criminal responsibility on the perpetrators, the vast majority of whom are no longer alive, but also triggering the duty upon Israel to provide remedies for the victims. And Arab states' involvement in the 1948-1949 war in response to the mass exodus of fellow Arabs by no means exonerates Israel from this responsibility. And the latter has only increased with Israel's settler colonial intent and policies in the occupied Palestinian territory becoming more apparent. These irrefutable historical facts and the state of the law in 1948 explain the UN's response to the Palestinian refugee question. It was Count Bernadotte, the UN mediator and former president of the Swedish Red Cross, and as such intimately familiar with the laws and lessons of the war, who was the first to assert that the refugees have the right to return to restitution of their properties, of their homes, and to compensation if the properties were destroyed or if they choose not to return, based on the applicable law at the time. And I'm emphasizing these points because it's often attempted by Israel to sort of suggest that there was no such thing as the right of return. There was only sort of a resolve of the UN General Assembly, but not based in law. And this is simply not correct. After his assassination by Jewish terrorists, because he called for return of the refugees, amongst other things, and following considerable deliberation, the UN General Assembly in late 1948 adopted Resolution 194, which, applying this existing law at the time, incorporated the late UN mediator's recommendation that the refugees were entitled to return to their original homes or to resettlement elsewhere with respect to those not willing to return, as well as compensation. These rights and related claims have only become stronger with the passing of time and the further advancement of international law, with the right of return being rooted in state responsibility because of the crimes that were committed at the time of the Nakba. The right of return has, in the years subsequent to the Second World War, also found its place in human rights law, as I said, which has further strengthened the nature of the Palestinian right of return. Then, with respect to the sort of the status of Palestinian refugees in international law, I referred to the fact that Palestinian refugees have been dispersed over more than 50 countries. International law has put in place a distinct regime for Palestinian refugees, not, as is often believed, a lesser regime. In other words, Palestinian refugees are as much refugees as all other refugees. They are not children of a lesser God. This regime includes a clear definition of who are the Palestinian refugees, and it provides them with fundamental rights based on a combination of different branches of international law. International refugee law, the principles of internal displacement, the law related to stateless persons, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. They together provide for a robust status of Palestinian refugee in international law, constituting a distinct regime. Under this regime, Palestinian refugees are entitled to international protection and assistance from UNRWA, I already mentioned, the Special UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and UNHCR, each with respect to the Palestinian refugees under its respective mandate. UNRWA's mandate, as I mentioned, is limited to the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestinians finding themselves outside those 5 areas are entitled to the protection and assistance by UNHCR. Like all other refugees, having access to protection and assistance, including access to different durable solutions. And a final introductory comment: in addition to being refugees, and I already mentioned it, most Palestinians are also stateless persons, with the exception of those in Jordan, in spite of Palestine's status as a non-observer state and increasing international recognition. There's no denial in the importance of this international recognition and of the recognition of Palestine as a non-member observer state, but in view of the ongoing occupation, Palestine is not able to exercise the full sovereignty over its territory, and therefore does not meet the constituent criteria for statehood. And as such, Palestinian refugees, with the exception of those in Jordan or those who obtained a certain country nationality, continue to be stateless persons in addition to being refugees. Statelessness, as Hannah Arendt indicated, not having the right to enjoy rights has even been almost a bigger impediment than sort of the refugee route that most Palestinians have coped with. Let me leave it.
Thank you, Lex. I mean, this was a very good introductory remarks. Let me actually start where you ended, and you ended with Hannah Arendt. And one of the things that we need to take into account when we speak about the issue of the Palestinian refugees is also to try and understand what are the infrastructure, conceptually and political infrastructure, that allowed, or sanctioned the creation of the Palestinian refugees issue. And Hannah Arendt was very prophetic back in the time when she said basically that if Zionism goes along the vulgar ethno-nationalism that it tries to achieve through, creating this Jewish entity in Palestine, it's going to create, chain of issues. And one of the things that Hannah Arendt was indicating was basically the direction of creating the refugee. And this is why the refugee as a figure features heavily and in a very prominent way in the writings of Hannah Arendt. And therefore, Hannah Arendt was actually already cautioning against, you know, the kind of realization of a very particular strand of Zionism, which was the dominant strand of Zionism, which basically entailed, in a way, a form of vulgar ethno-nationalism very much inspired by Central Europe and East Europe, where Zionism emerged as a European question, answering a European problem rather than a Palestinian or a Mediterranean thing. And this is linked to that. I think the question of the Palestinian refugees needs to be linked to the Nakba, as you indicated clearly. But then this needs to be tied to something wider. And this is, I think, is an extremely important thing to understand as a contextual element. And that is that the Palestinians, before Zionism, and surely with Zionism, definitely with the British Empire, have been dealing with this consistent, systematic issue of negation and denial. There is no way for you to understand modern Palestinian identity before the Nakba and surely after the Nakba in isolation from this dimension of negation, denial, and misrecognition. And the negation and the denial and the misrecognition is featuring heavily, in trying to underestimate and undermine the status of the refugees by making them less than what they are, rather than making them distinct, as you were suggesting. But even more importantly, understand the roots where this comes from, which is basically this issue of disrespecting the Palestinians as a political community that are entitled to basic rights as a nation. Chiefly among this is basically their self-independence and self-determination in their homeland. And therefore, any attempt to come and asking or trying to create a new entity, achieving a majority, that would definitely, inevitably, will reduce de-Arabization, ethnic cleansing, and basically elimination that, as you indicated, continues until today. And in that sense, the issue of the refugees and the Nakba is ongoing in the sense that it's not a historical event. Actually, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians today in the world are impacted on a daily basis, if not, you know, I would even suggest emotionally in a daily basis, but also practically for many Palestinians, from issues of freedom, of movement, of family, property, etc., and in this particular day. So this is an extremely important thing to put it in dimension, because we need to understand that this colonial mechanism of elimination, colonial imperial sophisticated system of negation, denial, and invisibilizing the Palestinians, either as individuals or as communities, you know, clearly gets further manifestation. This is where the Brits started with Barton occupation. It's a further manifestation by Zionism through different eliminatory policies that they were deploying through the different mechanisms of ethnic cleansing that were deployed. The second thing that I want to say, before I pose to you a question, I think the refugees are a fascinating entry because, for the Palestinian nationalism, because one of the most remarkable things about Palestinian nationalism post-Nakba time, that are the overwhelming majority of the founding fathers of Palestinian nationalism post-Nakba times are refugees themselves. Abu Iyad, Abu Jihad, George Habash, many of these people were refugees. Sorry. So, why I am indicating this? I am indicating this for two reasons. One is to say that for a very long period of time, until the 90s, Palestinian nationalism was largely exilic form of nationalism, meaning that the center of Palestinian politics were in refugee camps and lived largely by refugees. That is to suggest that the refugee, as an agent, as well as the refugee camp, as a site, but also as a metaphor, has inspired and mobilized hundreds and thousands of Palestinians to act in relation to the denial and the negation that was orchestrated mostly by Israel, second by Europe and the West, and shortly by some other Arab regimes that are well involved in this, okay? But the point that I want to make in here is to say that actually you cannot disconnect, and I'm not suggesting that you are making this claim, but I'm just adding to your introductory remark, you can't really understand and appreciate the right of Palestinian refugees to return in isolation from the other fundamental constitutive components of what constitutes the Palestine cause. The Palestinian cause is fundamentally about collective and individual rights, and now the center of our interest, collective rights. What are chiefly among these collective rights as well? Self-determination, freedom, and obviously the right of return, that they can obviously be individual rights as well. But this collective dimension means also, for something that I would like later to discuss, this is also an invitation for rethinking Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian nationalism made a serious compromise by giving up 78% or 22%, by suggesting that the state might be a vehicle within which Palestinians can realize rights, and this is failing and collapsing, and therefore now there is a very serious, kind of revival of rethinking Palestinian nationalism on this one. Now, but this takes me to the question that I nevertheless want to ask and pose. In your work together with Francesca Albanese, you have been interestingly also identifying the tension between articulating the question of the refugees as a legal humanitarian issue and between the way this has become politicized supposedly, as if we can distinguish between the legal and the political, but then we are in trouble if we don't distinguish in certain ways. So I would like to see and historicize this, because in your work you also show how historicizing these types of political engagement with the question sometimes is very troubling, but on the other hand, the commitment to the hypocrisy and the exception and the exceptionalizing of the Palestinian is very much premised on double standards, hypocrisy of the so-called, those who are committed from the perspective of human rights and protections of refugees, definitely in the West or Europe. So, I would like you in 5 minutes, if you wish, to pick and choose whatever you think is relevant for this conversation and try to elaborate on this before I basically want to ask you to make another introduction about the second half of what you have been doing, which is basically the solutions that I would like also to discuss with you, the solutions to the Palestinian question of refugees that you seem to be entertaining together with Francesca in the second half or towards the very end of your book. So please.
Well, thank you, Bashir. Great reflections, and indeed the tension between law and power and politics have been central throughout our research and are reflected in the book. And as Victor Cartan has often said and highlighted in one of his phenomenal books, in the Middle East, law seems to be closer to those with power than to the powerless, and indeed that's and in particular also with respect to the pursuit of solutions. One of the key issues when we look at how the refugee issue has been dealt with over the years, in particular since the start of the Middle East peace process, and then through the Oslo framework that was superimposed on it, and seen in many ways as a betrayal of what could have been meaningful and somewhat ethical process, is that by taking the refugee issue as an international issue and a responsibility of the United Nations into the Oslo framework, it was reframed as one of a number of so-called permanent status issues which were to be discussed at a later stage between Israel and the Palestinians, purely as a bilateral issue, leaving aside the other host countries and giving Israel effectively a veto on any progress with respect to the refugee issue. And that has had as a byproduct that international law was put to the sideline, in the discussions that have taken place in the framework of the Middle East peace process, and as well as in follow-up to the adoption of the Declaration of Principles on Palestinian, limited Palestinian self-rule. International law was sort of, considered a mere footnote, rather an obstacle to progress, rather than sort of the lighthouse through which solutions need to be pursued. So, very rightly so, we argue that has brought, as the broader peace process has not, had any tangible results other than fragmenting this remaining 22% in a series of enclaves. With respect to the refugee issue, it has totally caused a stalemate, whereby the international community, again, by adopting a humanitarian discourse, has done nothing but sort of managing the humanitarian situation rather than pursuing, trying to work towards solutions. And UNRWA, unlike UNHCR, has interpreted its mandate as excluding the pursuit of solutions, and as a result, leaving the Palestinians as the only group forced displaced without an agency acting towards a solution to their plight. So. International law has been sidelined and it hasn't.
Or hijacked in a way being reduced to become a humanitarian issue. I mean, once you label them something like a humanitarian issue, then that's the business of churches and charities and philanthropy to step in. And that might be a result of like a, God intervention or divine intervention of some sort, or an earthquake of some sort, where the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian refugees has been systematically orchestrated by, a state-sponsored, and before that, a pre-state structure that called the issue, and the different arms, militarized arms, that orchestrated this in a way, or, in a very clear way. And therefore, to come and depict this as a humanitarian issue has very serious stress. This is why Palestinians, in general, and surely the Palestinian leadership and the PLO for some historical reasons, but also at historical period, without romanticizing this position, obviously, have been very reluctant to engage with the question of the refugees, exclusively, through the lenses of this humanitarian issue. They definitely could have done better in certain contexts. They could have done serious revisions at certain historical junctions. But I think the sentiments remain to be valid about the fear of reducing the question only to be humanitarian issue, because that's a very serious issue, because the minute you are making the humanitarian, you are not asking the real questions, and the real questions are, that the Palestinians are the victims of a settler colonial movement, that they continue to be. Anyway, do you mind if you elaborate in 5 minutes or so on the solutions, because I think that seems to be also a very provocative. I found it at least provocative. In certain parts of it for me, I might...
Yes, with pleasure. And part of it is to undo that process whereby the refugee issue, has been framed as a bilateral issue to be dealt with between the Palestinians and Israelis, and is being dealt with as a humanitarian issue only. We argue in the book that the UN must sort of resume responsibility for the pursuit of solutions for Palestinian refugees, like it ultimately does for all other refugee crises. In the UNHCR's modus operandi, assistance, protection, and solutions are always dealt with in tandem. And as an extension of this, like with all other refugee situations, international law must be the framework and lighthouse for resolving the issue. International law as such does not have the answer, but it sets the frame for dealing with the moral, the material, individual, and collective justice aspect of a refugee situation. The third cornerstone of our paradigm shift is that the acquisition of asylum and third country citizenship, or in other words, the components of solutions other than return, does not jeopardize the right of return and the right to restitution and to compensation. In other words, Palestinians should feel free to seek the solutions that meet their needs and those of their families, rather than being held captive in what American anthropologist in a beautiful book on Palestinians in Syria calls the politics of suffering. And with that she refers to the long-held belief that pursuing solutions for Palestinians more holistically beyond sort of the claim for return would undermine their rights and claims towards Israel, and as such jeopardize the Palestinian cause, which is simply not valid. As I indicated earlier, the right of return is very strongly enshrined in international law, and whether individual Palestinian refugees continue to live in substandard camps in the region or live in a villa in Beverly Hills, that does not change their rights under international law. And so we argue in the book that to pursue this paradigm shift, it is important to realign the discourse on the Palestinian refugee question more closely with the general international refugee regime. And we believe that in particular the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2016, which was an attempt by the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, to push back after the 2015 refugee crisis, and in particular the Turkey deal, which was seen as a major challenge to the international refugee regime. What Grandi tried to do was to, through a solemn proclamation by the entire international community, to sort of reassert the cornerstone of the international refugee regime and the centrality of international law in protecting and seeking solutions for refugees. This declaration was unanimously adopted by all 193 member states of the General Assembly of the United Nations, with no reservations or no interpretative comments, including the US and Israel. Now, Filippo Grandi, as many of you probably know, was formerly Commissioner General of UNRWA, and his envoy for the New York Declaration was Karen Abu Zaid, another former Commissioner General of UNRWA. And so it's no surprise that the New York Declaration does not exclude, and rather includes, through a number of subtle references, Palestinian refugees from its purview. And so through this New York Declaration, and the fact that it extends to Palestinian refugees, the first two elements of the power of the paradigm shift that we advocate for, bring it back under the responsibility of the UN and the centrality of international law are achieved. Now, the New York Declaration also calls for the adoption of a so-called comprehensive refugee response framework for each large-scale refugee situation, not just for new refugee problems, but also, and importantly, also for protracted refugee situations, like the Afghan refugee crisis, as well as the Palestinian refugee situation. Now, what is in there for the Palestinians? These comprehensive response frameworks are a tool to, through a multi-stakeholder approach involving host countries and host governments, involving representatives of the refugees, civil society, the business community, international organizations, NGOs, to sort of comprehensively agree on an approach of dealing with that refugee situation. And depending on the nature of the refugee problem, look at root causes, look at conditions in the country of origin, look at the opportunities for local integration, see where resettlement is in order, etc. So we argue that it would be, now that we know that Palestinian refugees are included in the remit of the New York Declaration, that it would be appropriate to also elaborate such a framework for Palestinian refugees, a comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugees, as we call it in the book. And doing this, you know, first, it does not require a new mandate of the General Assembly. The mandate is already there. In the broadest political sense of the word, 193 member states having supported this idea. It would bring both UNHCR and UNRWA in a process, each for the refugees for which it is responsible, in a process of rethinking the 70-year-old refugee situation of the Palestinians through I've called it in other presentations, state-of-the-art 21st century toolbox. Now, what would this mean in practice if UNRWA and UNHCR, encouraged by the UN Secretary General, engage in a process to develop such a framework? It would have to address somehow the root causes of the refugee situation. Now, in other contexts, truth commissions and those kind of mechanisms have been put in place post-conflict. But in the 70-year-old Palestinian situation, this cannot wait. And so it would be an opportunity for a UN-sanctioned process whereby conversations can be held on the root causes of the refugee issue, but also on the relations of the refugees with the various host communities where Palestinians have found themselves, including, for example, the problematic relationship between Palestinian refugees and the Lebanese state. It will provide opportunities for such discussion. Similar to other development of such comprehensive frameworks, they are developed in a reiterative process where various drafts are circulated and provided for input to civil society, to academia, to governments, to political actors. And so we believe that the process of developing such a framework would provide an opportunity to break through the current stalemate where essentially through UNRWA the international community manages the refugee issue without looking at solutions. And rather than having to amend and fix sort of UNRWA's mandate or to revitalize the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, which was the original body set up to sort of seek for a solution to the refugee issue, but because it was not able to make progress, became defunct from 1965 onwards. So rather than sort of revitalizing the UNCCP or changing UNRWA's mandate, through the process of this development of a comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugees, practically the discourse towards solutions can be reactivated. We don't think this will be easy. There will be huge hurdles. There will be obviously the usual suspect who will try to block this process. But once again, the mandate is already there, and what what it needs to get going is essentially a nod between the Secretary General and the Commissioner General of UNRWA and the High Commissioner for Refugees, and carefully start moving on this road. And we believe that, yes, as I said, it will not be an easy process, but doing nothing is also not an option, and it will tie in with and could even help advance the broader discourse around the unresolved question of Palestine.
Two comments very quickly before we move to the audience. I mean, I kind of have sympathy of some sort to the proposal you are putting forward, but I have some serious fears about that. And the serious fears are many, but I don't have time. I want to mention two. And one fear is that you seem to be capitalizing too much on, on the consistency of the international law. I mean, international law is important, but international law is very much also, orchestrated, mediated by serious power relations of some sort. So the process that you seem to be proposing might be very troubling in certain consequences if we are not guaranteeing in that process something that is effectively decolonizing some very significant features, not only in relation to Israel, but in relation to the way international law has been not applied, or selectively applied, or abused and used when it comes to the Palestinian cause. So I think here we need to, it's not an accusation, it's just that I am sharing with you a fear. Because you speak about return compensation and resettlements in host countries as well as in third countries. And one of the things that we have been seeing, as much as there is this humanitarian human urgency for people to improve their standards of living, that they should not be contingent and depending on certain political solutions, but at the same time, a process that is not clearly framed and clearly mandated by enforceable kind of deliverables of some sort might lead, based on very clear experiences, how selectively international law is used, abused, and deployed, to actually eroding and weakening the centrality of the Palestinian refugee question the way it has been happening under the rubric of Oslo. The last point that I want to make, I do think with these types of qualifications that I am trying to indicate to, your question, if it is within the frame of decolonizing also some parts of the international law, and definitely the Israeli engagements and some other factors in that, could be a very interesting entry in conceptualizing how you envision a future joint dwelling between Arabs and Jews between the river and the sea. Because you are already, by invoking these processes that you seem to be suggesting, i.e. truth commissions, etc., with all the troubles that might come with the issue of incrementality and stages and sequence, you are definitely proposing an alternative approach that is not peacemaking, which is very troubling, which is also, which is basically marginalized, weakened, and basically underestimated the significance of the Palestinian refugees. Now, the things that are happening, that the centrality of the refugees question, are actually emerging from constituencies and circles that are not captured by conventional Palestinian politics. And this is part and parcel of rethinking Palestinian nationalism that is undergoing, that are not captured by the rhetoric of the conventional Palestinian politics. So, I mean, again, I see, because if you want to envision a form of a settlement, not a settlement, a form of historical reconciliation in Palestine, the right of Palestinian refugees to return is the beginning and the end of the story as part and parcel of a larger cluster of issues that has to do with self-determination and freedom. And this is a different type of engaging with the Israeli Jews for a joint future. So in that sense, I think you are also, if I were to understand you with the qualification that I am presenting here, that worry me, you might be actually proposing a very different alternative form of how you deal with issues that are alternative to basically peacemaking and conflict resolution, but actually are robust, transformative, therein addressing the root causes, seeing the larger picture, putting at the central issue decolonization and that process. Now, I will give you the time to reply to this, but try to make it that 1 minute because we want to close the camera for those who have been with us online before we move to our friends. So can you please say like a minute or two very briefly and we'll continue.
Well, I totally agree with you. We initially developed our thinking on this final chapter at the time the Trump administration was still there, and we had conversations about our ideas with a group of Palestinians who at the time were sort of saying, although we see the attractiveness of using an existing mandate to create a new discourse around Palestinian refugees and indirectly to the broader question of Palestine, we were also very worried about the international community cherry picking, and they will love the idea of a more holistic approach to solutions and see it as an opportunity to further sell out on the right of return. So we recognize that concern, but we also strongly believe that pursuing solutions more holistically, giving, and not negatively judging Palestinians, for example, Palestinians from Syria who are in Lebanon and who see that, that vulnerable Syrians from Lebanon qualify for selective resettlement in certain countries, but they as Palestinians, because they're Palestinians, they cannot avail of such opportunities. The same for vulnerable, for very sick Palestinians from Gaza that in other contexts could qualify for medical treatment in certain countries. I mean, because they're Palestinians and UNHCR is not responsible for them, and UNRWA does not see itself as being responsible for solutions. Such opportunities are not there. And the point we're making, if those opportunities are pursued, and many individual Palestinians, have made their way to European countries or to the West, and they should not be criticized for, for doing so. And it doesn't jeopardize the principal, quest for implementation of the right of return, restitution, compensation. So yes, yes, there is a fear and there is a reason for concern, but we believe one does not negate the other. Indeed, the thinking that we had is that here is a process available, a potential process available that under UN auspices allows a fresh look at the unresolved refugee question, including elements of looking at root causes. And we're not saying it necessarily needs to happen in this framework. I mean, it's encouraging that the UN Commission of Inquiry that has been established after the events of April-May last year has also been mandated to look at root causes. So UN-sanctioned work on root causes, which has been essentially absent since the demise of the Conciliation Commission for Palestine, is beginning to happen, and is very important. I mean, we need to get it out of this bilateral framework and let the UN resume its responsibility. I've also been thinking that by, you've been advocating for properly framing the unresolved situation away from the peace process discourse, from the state building discourse, from the development discourse, from the humanitarian discourse, and really adopting a decolonization discourse. I mean, I think Palestine, the state of Palestine, should consider taking advantage of the framework that the UN put in place for decolonization at the time it was established, and of which Israel-Palestine was excluded. I think this is the time to call for the inclusion of Palestine in a UN decolonization framework, which doesn't require consent of the Security Council, which can happen with a simple UN General Assembly resolution.
And I would like to thank those who are with us on video, so we are going to close now with those who are with video. Thank you very much for being with us. And now we will open the floor for questions, so please.